Thank you for the interesting discussion, and thank you, Mirel, for giving the floor. So our section would be about share options. Maybe not very, initially maybe not sounding very important topic, but somehow it has become more and more important when Estonian companies are flipping to the US, or when US investors are coming in, either as shareholders or sometimes just as an investor. So this can be maybe described the best by the latest birth of Estonian unicorn, and newspaper articles about that, which highlighted it as a very, very big event for Estonia, which it indeed was. But somehow share option topics got lots of attention, starting from 66% tax risk and guiding employees through the environment of that tax risk and managing the fears. Also having tax certainties by asking binding rulings from tax board, which eventually can delay the whole deal, and so on and so forth. So it has becoming more interesting question over time to understand why it is so, why we face those mismatches, so to speak, why we see those issues, why we have those US and Baltic questions when US investors coming in. So this is what we try to answer or discuss a bit in this panel. First, I would like to give floor back to Taavi again. So Taavi have prepared some great slides about share options from the US side. So Taavi, please, I give the floor to you.
All right, let me see if I can get my slides up again. So I'll try to take about 15 minutes, put a timer, on talking about how US companies view equity incentives that they grant to their employees. And that relates to both startups, but also mature companies, because we talk about really two scenarios here. One is when you flip to the US, or when you come to the US and you start issuing stock options or other equity incentives from your topco, US topco, to your employees all around the world. Because the feature of having a US parent company means that your equity incentives, your options or other incentives are going to come from the US parent company. And then I'm going to talk about a little bit how other companies view it, because what Kite already suggested, the challenges may come when the foreign company acquires the Estonian company and uses its for a more mature company uses its equity incentives for its worldwide employees. So I'll start with what is standard in the US for startups when you set up a company, what the investors expect and what your US employees would expect. The standard for that level is stock options, which allows the recipient, the employee, to purchase shares for a predetermined exercise price. There are two types of those. Some of these are incentive stock options, which are limited to employees, and others are so-called non-qualified stock options. On paper, they look very similar, and the difference is in tax consequences. ISOs are different. Have different tax consequences for both employees and the company. So when I'm talking why the options are used and what the employees would expect from those options, it really matters which kinds are given. The other alternative that startups use, especially in very early stages, are restricted stock. And I'll get there shortly, why only in early stages. Which basically means that the employee gets shares of the company, but the employee cannot do anything with the shares until they have vested, until usually some certain time has passed, or some performance criteria are met. But then once the vesting has occurred, the employees will actually become shareholders without any further action. I mean, they are shareholders already when they grant them, but they can actually have the shares free and clear, so to say. So investors in the US, startups, usually expect startups to set aside a certain percentage of the capitalization table for those equity incentives to employees. I put here 10 to 20%. There is a fair amount of variation depending on where you are. West Coast equity incentive pools tend to be significantly higher than Midwest or East Coast equity incentives. So I'm in St. Louis. I work with companies on all around both West Coast, East Coast, and Midwest, and I can definitely see that the more west you go, the more the equity incentives, the larger the pool is. All right, let's go to the next slide. So when stock options are given, there are some very standard terms that startups are expected to use for granting stock options. They are memorialized also in those in this package of 5 main investment documents, so-called NDCA forms, where investors say that your stock options have to meet those following terms. They're usually time-based vesting, 4-year vesting schedule with 1-year cliff. Investors hate accelerated vesting provisions, meaning that if the company is sold in year 2, the employee should not get shares worth of 4 years of vesting. They very often do, but if the acquirer wants to roll over some of those options, then the acquirer has the chance to do it and keep the vesting schedule for the old options in place. Next one is what is maybe one of the bigger differences between US and what I've seen in Baltics is in the US, the exercise price of your normal stock options has to equal at least the fair market value of a share of common stock on date of grant. It's heavily driven by tax rules. It relates to deferred compensation rules. I'm not going to go into too much detail why that is the case, but we'll touch on a related point shortly. So when options are granted, the companies are expected by investors, at least past the very earliest stages, to obtain an independent third-party valuation opinion, so-called 409A valuation, that establishes what the fair market value of the share of common stock is. I mean, obviously, it's just an opinion. But why it's important is that for IRS, the tax authorities, the IRS will defer to that valuation, and they will say, okay, you have satisfied this rule. If your exercise price is lower, just nominal value, or even just a cent lower than the fair market value, it brings with it tremendously bad tax consequences. And when investors do due diligence with you, they usually will, one of the questions is, can you share all your 409A valuations with us? Just to make sure that you've done it. And then they will compare the option agreements to make sure that the options have been granted at that value. The options have a 10-year term. Often you must exercise within a certain time period after termination of employment. It's required for incentive stock option treatment, but very often all option holders are required to do it. Usually it's a 3-month period. That is changing and has changed. Many companies are being more generous to their employees, saying, okay, we don't force you to exercise, because exercising an option means that, and we'll get there shortly as well, you at least have to pay the exercise price. But even worse, in many cases, you also have to pay taxes. At least for non-qualified stock options. So those 3 key terms are used for US employees, and they are very standard. For employees outside US, many companies prefer, and many investors prefer, the employees to have the same terms. Companies typically do use supplements to their the planned equity incentive plan to provide for any country-specific terms or country-specific rules. I know Estonian option agreements that I've seen always have something about the 3-year holding period. and how to deal with these. I've heard there are different rules in different other countries. I've had an Israeli subsidiary where the Israeli employees have to deposit their options in a trust, and the plan has to be registered with the Israeli tax authorities. So we would, in the US plan, we would, with the Israeli council, we would then adopt certain specific rules for Israeli options to get the favorable tax treatment there. All right. So how are the options taxed? Because here is where, both for the startups, but also upon acquisition, we run into difficulties. So on all stock options, there is no income tax on grant or vesting, so long as they meet those deferred comp rules, the fair market value of the exercise price, and so forth. So incentive stock options are not taxable even upon exercise, so there is no tax even when you exercise. Although what the US does is there are so-called alternative minimum tax rules that ensure that high-income individuals don't pay too little tax. And exercise of incentive stock options are taken into account in that calculation. And you end up actually potentially paying taxes on exercise of all stock options through those special rules. And when you sell the shares that you have exercised and have held those for at least 1 year, you get very favorable capital gains rates, tax rates, which are currently either 15 or 20%. If your income is very low, it's even zero. But until a certain threshold of income, it's 15%, after that 20%, plus some state and local taxes potentially. State taxes also vary, I think, from 0 to 13%. California and New York are among the highest tax localities. So from US perspective, this is incredibly attractive outcome. It is not available when you exercise right before the company is sold, because then you sell your shares right away too. You don't meet the 1 year holding period, and you pay taxes on ordinary income tax rates. Non-qualified stock options are treated a little bit differently. They are taxed on exercise, on the difference between fair market value of the shares upon exercise and their exercise price. So if you buy them out for $10 a share and the stock price is $20 at that point with a fair market value, then at the time of exercise, there may be no exit. You pay taxes on $10 of income gain, and you pay that ordinary income rates, which is up to 37%, the top income rates, but plus there are some special taxes on state, local, so social security level, and those all can add up to a fair amount of taxes. I think the California rate here is also the 13%, and there can be a few percent of local, plus some special social security taxes, so they add up pretty nicely. Going back to the capital gains rates, I underlined they're currently 15 to 20%. I think it was last week when Joe Biden revealed his kind of tax proposal for this administration, and they the current intent is for those with an income over $1 million, for that rate to go from 20% to about 40%. So is that set in stone? No. And with 40% plus 30% state plus some percentage local, you end up being in the 60% range that you see in Estonia, I guess. Now you think, oh, nobody makes $1 million, but think about that. If you exercise at the time when those options are also sold, it could really, your company has become a unicorn, you could actually make $1 million that year. You never know, right? So, but the key, and as I understand, at least a big difference to Estonia is, if you exercise a year or two and you have incentive stock options, you may have no tax whatsoever for at all. Although you do have to pay an exercise price, which is a difference if you just have a nominal exercise price. So those are the key features of stock options. I mentioned there are alternatives, restricted stock awards. Either restricted stock, which is a grant of actual shares that are subject to restrictions or forfeiture if you leave before vesting, or restricted stock units, the feature which is they turn into actual shares upon vesting. Restricted stock is used by startups in early stages because what the company and the employee can do is, upon grant, the employee can pay taxes on the value of those shares when they're granted. And when those shares are granted, when the company has just been founded, the value of those shares in the eyes of the IRS, or at least you can convince the IRS, can be very close to zero, meaning that you pay taxes on $0 of income that you just got from the company. And then over time, when those restricted shares vest, you do not pay any additional taxes. You pay taxes when you sell the shares. Restricted stock units are somewhat similar, except you can't really do any 3B election, but you pay taxes when they vest. So if you get restricted stock units early on when they are not worth anything yet, because the company has been just founded, and then 2 years go by, the company's value is now $10 million. Your one share of stock is worth about $10 a share. You have 1,000 shares. You suddenly are hit with a $10,000 income tax, or $10,000 of gain that you pay income taxes on those ordinary income tax rates. And that is usually incredibly unattractive. One big difference between the Baltics, as I understand, at least Estonia and US, is can you just hold on to those restricted stock units and have them kind of turn into shares when the employee wants? And the answer here is almost certainly no. The problem is we get back to this deferred compensation issues and deferred compensation traps. In the US, when if you remember Enron scandals, one feature of what the executives did, they defer their compensation and took it out later, or tried to take it out later, in order to defer also their taxes. The IRS, the US tax authorities, are really cracked down on that. And it is very, very, very difficult to defer compensation to a desired time point by employees. So that's why it works for restrict, and let's go to the last slide. I think it's live. Yeah. All right. So the incentives like restricted stock units, they are not often used in startups because they are taxable upon vesting, and people don't really have money at that point to pay the taxes. But it's much more common in mature companies, especially in case of publicly traded companies, because when your RSUs, the restricted stock units, turn into actual shares, you know what those shares are worth, and even better, those shares can be sold in the public markets and to get cash to pay for the taxes on that. In mature companies, RSUs are also another reason why they are used more than options, or are used just as much as options. Both are used, is that in a startup, options make a lot of sense because when you grant options with a fair market value at the time of grant, of exercise price, the value of the shares has to increase for those options to be worth anything to you. In a startup, we expect all the shares to increase in value. In a mature company, it's not given that the stock price will just keep going up. It can be just the company is happy with the stock price and pays dividends or whatnot, and it's not granted or given at all that the stock price keeps just growing. And if you just granted options with a fair market value of the or the exercise price of fair market value at the time of grant, those options will potentially never make a whole lot of money. Whereas restricted stock units, the feature of those is you get a certain number of shares and they turn into actual shares with some guaranteed value. You just have to stick around to be there. All right, I'm exhausting my time. There are some other incentives that are used. Sometimes the vesting is tied to performance conditions. Stock appreciation rights function pretty much like stock options. Some companies use phantom equity, which is not preferred for tax perspective. And I'm not going to go into pass-through entities because that would take another hour of your time to explain how US pass-through entities work, which I do not recommend for startups, especially with foreign owners. All right.
Okay, thank you, Tavi. It was really interesting. And while waiting when my slides get up, really appreciate your comment on RSUs, because we have to deal with these all the time in Estonia, and it's quite tricky because to have the tax benefits under Estonian law and for Estonian employees, we have to somehow design those RSUs to fit under Estonian share option definition, and we have the same issue in all the Baltic countries. So it's quite an academic exercise all the time. Okay, but provided that we have now seen what the US investor thinks when coming in, or how the US employees would see what would be the normal share option plan, let's give a short view on the Baltic states as well. I checked the index venture table on the competitiveness of different share option tax regimes, and surprisingly, I found Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania on top of that table. So somehow we have really beneficial regime for share options. And indeed, share options are really commonly used in the Baltics. I'm really happy about that. I know our tax authorities are really happy about that, because it enables Estonian employees to become owners of the company, even if the company goes global. Obviously, these are used by startups to basically pay salaries, not in cash, which startups usually do not have, but are paid in equity. So in Estonia, for example, salary taxes are more or less 45% of the investment the investor makes into the company. So if this is an employment-heavy company, then 45% of the investment would go to salary taxes, 65% will produce further gain. So it does not sound really normal division of risks and contribution between state and investors. So this is how our salary system also supports incentivizing employees with share options. And all the Baltic states provide tax beneficial regimes for paying salaries with share options. So moving to the next slide, I think it will unlock the reason why Baltic states are on top of the competitiveness table of the share option taxation. It's simplicity. After heard what Tavi said, what kind of share option tax regimes and incentive regimes you have available, what kind of requirements must be met for that, in the Baltic states, situation is rather easy. So in all countries, private and public limited companies can give share options, also in Latvia. So this change was made recently, which is interesting compared to the US, is that when we talk about exercise price, it is quite common that the exercise price is zero or something slightly above the zero. For example, the nominal value of the capital increase, which is done when the options are issued. It's not fair market value in most of the cases. So in that sense, share options are much more, at least sounds to be much more accessible for employees in the Baltics than in the US, where it's common to ask employees to pay the exercise price of fair market value. So exercise price is basically like a buy-in price for the employee, and if you don't have the money, then in Estonia it's quite typical that you can afford share options. In the US, it may be a problem. And what's the main incentive in the Baltics? In all three countries, if you wait long enough with exercising the share options, you can get the shares without any taxes. In Latvia, it is 1 year, so it was reduced some time ago from 3 years, I believe. And in Estonia and Lithuania, it's still 3 years. So you have to wait for 1 year if you hold Latvian share option. or your employee in Latvia who holds share options in Latvian or whatever companies, then you fall under Latvian tax regime. And if you wait 1 year, it's exempt from taxes upon exercise. So yeah, as you can see, Latvia has got the lead in the Baltics, at least from the tax benefit side. But happily, Estonia is considering also some, or at least the community is considering to propose some changes. And I got some ideas from Taavi's presentations where we can get the lead again in Estonia or Latvia. And yeah, as it is in the US, then upon the sale of shares, we have the normal capital gains tax. Now, the issues we face when the US investors or new owners come in does not occur usually when the old Estonian stock option plans are kept. So there may be questions about option pool, tax risks to be mitigated, but that's more or less it. But the problems usually start when the option plans are rolled over from Estonian plans to the US plans, and then it gets really interesting. So from the last slide, I have made a small table on that, which should demonstrate where the difficulties kick in. So please put on the last slide. Yeah, the most common issue we have seen in the Estonia, and I understand from the colleagues that also in other Baltic states, is that if the plans are rolled over, then usually these are rolled over to RSUs or some performance stock units. So what we have to do in the Baltics is somehow try to fit the RSUs and PSUs and all other stuff under the definitions of share options we have here in the Baltics, because we don't basically use other types of equity-based incentive schemes here. Phantom options are sometimes used, but these are taxed as salaries, so not much point to use these. And obviously we have this 3-year exercise rule because of the tax exemption period. In the US, as we heard, it often can be 4 years. So again, we have to change the terms of the option plans, and it raises again questions whether you can do it without triggering the restart of the waiting period for tax exempt exercise, and what other difficulties it may bring. And basically this relates to also the thing that we have to somehow accommodate RSUs under our share option definitions. And yeah, I think the most practical issue we see is change of exercise price from 0 to fair market value. So this is really something which can make options, or at least exercising the options, less available for employees. And yeah, setting aside maybe the technical stuff like having formal requirements to sign the option agreements in a specific way, like in Estonia we have digital signature requirement. In the US, I believe it's more flexible, so that's yet again another issue we have to usually deal, how to sort of organize the grant of options and also rollover so that we meet all those formal signing requirements. And besides that, we have very practical questions like how to be clear waters with the taxation, tax risks, which quite often leads to asking questions from tax board, which can stop the arrangements for sometimes. For Estonia, if you ask binding ruling, you have to wait for it for 2 months. So this is something you have to build in your teal timeline, and then which can make employees sometimes anxious when they wait the exercise and then sale or cashing out their share options. Okay, so that is sort of a bird's eye view on the Baltic side, how we see share options, and how simple the taxation is from our side. Now, it would be appropriate now to go to the panel discussion and discuss over some topics to try to sort of find and understand where the key pain points are, which we need to handle, and how the US side would see how we would handle these. And in this panel, I would welcome again Taavi, quite obviously. And we have also Jānis Taukas, who is tax partner of Sorainen in Latvian office, and also our regional head of our tax group. So Jānis, can you hear us? Everything is well?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Hello.
Thank you, thank you. Team was off yesterday, some global issues, so just checking to be sure. Okay, so going on with the discussion and the topics, Jānis, maybe coming to you first, and then which concerns the Baltic startups the most and then tech companies the most, I guess, is what has your experience been? What are the worst case studies you have encountered with share options and tax issues when US investors kick in, and then you have to deal with these somehow, and then what the lessons have been from that?
Yes, Kaido, thanks. I think if you, on the face, it seems very simple, but if you want to get rid of the very complex US tax issues that Taavi just told us about, then basically what you need to have employees really working in the Baltics, and then you have tax treaty protection that those people will be taxed in the Baltics, not in the US. So we are then looking at the Baltic tax incentives and on the share options. And if we look at for example, Latvian share option scheme possibilities and tax restrictions, there are basically just two main rules that you have to apply. That first of all, like Kaido just told, that you need to have this 1 year vesting period, and the second main rule is that you need to register those share option plans with the tax authorities. So on the face, it's very simple, but still we have seen that on those cases that our clients are coming up with, even with those simple rules, the clients are really struggling, and and at the end of the day, we have seen cases where those tax incentives were not really applied, and all the big payroll taxes were paid. And as one of such cases, I would highlight that Latvian employees were having US stock options and stock option plans, and one US company sold the company to the other US big group, and there was a payout to the employees, and as a result of such takeover, the shares were sold sooner than within the 3-year period that we previously also had in Latvia. Now this 1 year period is only effective from the 1st of January this year. So in that case, obviously this didn't work out. And the other case I've seen is that company just held options for 3 years, but didn't register these options with the tax authorities. And I would highlight that the registration of the share options can be with the tax authorities for share option scheme, either with the Latvian company or somewhere else in the whole world within the group of the company. So and it can be applied even if there is no Latvian company, but even if there is no permanent establishment. But if there are employees, for example, in Latvia of the US company, still this can work. So these are the problems that I have seen in practice.
Yeah. Thank you, Alice. And I have to ask, if you don't comply those tax rules in Latvia, can you go to jail or not?
Well, I don't think you can normally, because in such cases really I have seen cases where especially in the IT sector, where the local companies have done some very aggressive things from the tax point of view, but currently the local tax authorities have been very sort of say mild, although the threshold of unpaid taxes for criminal liability is comparably low, 25,000 euros of unpaid taxes. Still, I haven't seen anything aggressive from the authorities unless there is a real intent in doing so, and that has to be proven, of course.
Mm. And Taavi, can I ask your comment if you were advising US investors and then coming into those case studies Janis described, what are your suggestions, feelings, and do you see already deal breakers here or solutions?
So I don't think any of this will ever be a deal breaker. If US investor likes the company, they will view this as a human resource management issue first and foremost. In terms of the goal of the investor is to make sure that the company is doing great, and the way for the company to do great is keep their employees motivated and employees happy. It's in nobody's interest whatsoever to cause bad tax outcomes if those can be avoided. From US perspective, I think the challenge here is that the goal for the advisors on both sides is to explain to the business people why those equity incentives have to work differently in the Baltic states. Once you get through that hurdle, you can take the discussion to the next level. Okay, what does it mean? Are we treating those employees fairly compared to the other group employees, potentially if they're employees in multiple places in the US and in Estonia or Latvia, Lithuania? Are we treating them fairly? Are we giving them something that everybody should get, or are we giving them too much? But at that point, it's no longer kind of a legal discussion. It's much more of a discussion among human resources professionals who have to figure out what is the right compensation package, taking into account that the equity incentives look a little bit differently. I have never seen issues like this become a deal breaker, but definitely it requires extra work, and that's where, like, I have a very limited ability to advise the US clients about what those options should look like in Estonia, because I'm not qualified to do that in Estonia. So the burden there is really on the local Estonian council. From an investor perspective, the easiest by far is to say everybody in those countries has to get exactly the same as everybody in the US. And the investor says, yeah, this is all standard, we all understand how it works. But if that's not feasible, then we have to go into those next step discussions. I don't have like a great solution to this. I think this is a discussion that needs to transform from a legal to a human resources or kind of people management discussion. What is the right compensation package, taking into account what is feasible?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, it was really interesting point that it can fall to Estonian advisors to sort of find solution in some peculiar details. So if I would ask from you that you come with a client who buys Estonian company, wants to roll over Estonian options to share RSUs in the US company, and we now must fit those RSUs under share option definition in Estonia, and then we build a construct saying that the employee gets the RSUs but has a right to refuse to accept those or give back or something like that. So this is what we have to do in Estonia to somehow be able. So do you sort of tolerate that, or what your client would do? Go crazy or work towards it?
So the first reaction of the client is no way, right? I mean, this is like a basic 409A issue. We can't do it. because this is deferred comp rules, and you get hit immediately with 20% excise tax plus the immediate taxation of all your income, whatnot. But then that's kind of maybe the first reaction that, and I had this recently discussion with Investor Council, where they were like, oh, so how do your options work in Estonia? I explained, in that case, we really tried to just fit them under US rules, and it worked. The Estonian options actually can work as US rules work. So, but then the first reaction after that is, well, they are not US taxpayers. Why would we care? Why would we care about deferred compensation rules? Because they're never going to pay those taxes because they're not US taxpayers, as Yanni said, right? They remain Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian taxpayers. And if we don't create an issue under Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian taxes for them, it should not be that big of a deal. At that point, I would have to just explain with the help of the local council to the acquirer or the investor, well, this is the best we can do. The one difference is kind of the exercise price, the RSU difference. The other thing is, well, then they will say, well, in US, everybody gets stock options. I guess if in US, everybody gets stock options, but that's not the case here. Why do the Estonians get a nominal exercise price? I mean, but that's the people management discussion. Why would Estonian employees have the right to defer their tax hit where the US employees cannot do it? But again, that's a HR discussion. Say, well, in Estonia, we just have to do it because otherwise the company gets hit by 60% tax. And then every business person will say, I don't want to get a 60% tax hit, right?
Yeah, sounds logical. Yeah, it was actually a really interesting point about equal treatment of Estonian and US employees. And as it may hit quite of a surprise sometimes, as we have maybe a practice of having lower exercise price in the Baltics and fair market value exercise price in the US, it raises a question how whether equal treatment laws can get in and whether employees should have this insurance you were talking about earlier. So Janis, what is your experience? What is a common practice about the exercise prices in the Baltics? Are those rather zero, nominal value, or something higher?
Well, I think mostly it's quite similar to Estonia, so that the employees really get either zero or very nominal price for exercising, and then once they get the shares and then sell the shares, then they are paying 20% tax on capital gains. So that's the whole benefit. So I wouldn't say we have any different approach.
Yeah, it sounds really like Estonia. I guess it's driven also from tax part, because we don't have anything related to fair market value, either on grant or exercise, like it is in the UK, for instance, where you have those EMIs and so on. Okay, but Taavi, can you comment my question I had about this equal treatment, whether it would be actually an issue if Estonian employees have different exercise price than US employees under the same plan, maybe? Is it something you have to be insured against?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, being located in Estonia versus US should not be a ground for a differential treatment claim. It could cause more of a management issue. I mean, the US employees may be unhappy if Estonian gets a different benefit or better benefit, but the systems are so different. There are other things that are different as well, and that has never, in my experience, given rise to a big legal concern. I mean, US employees don't have the benefits that Estonian employees do. Estonian employees can be fired only on certain grounds, and they get severance payments. US employees are at will. There are many differences in the employment systems, and that usually, I have not seen that become an issue yet.
Okay, great. I'm happy to hear that, because yeah, if Estonians would have to start paying fair market value all the time, it can get tricky. I can assume. Okay, Janis, coming back to you, and I think it would be our last discussion point. Based on your experience and then from this discussion, what do you think? What local companies, startups, tech companies can do better with their share options to be prepared for having US new owner and having the new plan to which the old plan will be rolled over and facing the issues? So what can be done better to be prepared?
Well, it's a very broad question, but definitely I think that judging from my experience, I can see that if the Latvian businesses or Baltic businesses want to look for bigger foreign investors, they have to do their homework and prepare the companies that everything they do is by the book, and there are no local problems with the taxation, like we have seen that sometimes it has been almost a deal breaker, that the local tax structuring has been so aggressive that basically the tax guys who are advising the foreign investor are scratching their noses and thinking what to do with this, and really raising some issues, not only eyebrows regarding the possible criminal liability and these kind of stuff. So this is one. The other is look for opportunities. Currently, I think there is a big unrealized potential of using these share options in the local markets, and so the companies can be much more successful in using these share options incentives. There are special incentives for startups now made much broader in Latvia since September last year, where basically if to special council the innovation has been proven, that then there's a possibility of only 10% payroll taxes, which is huge benefit currently, but not very popular for some reason. I think for a reason that the startups were actually have an obligation to have a venture capital investment, which is not a mandatory requirement now for applying these tax incentives. So and from beginning of this year, there are different classes of shares available on for limited liability companies. So I think just look around and use the existing opportunities, and then many can be more successful.
Thank you, Janis. And then Tavi, what thoughts you have about or what recommendations can you give for Estonian startups, like one or two, how to be more prepared for this US investor coming with their own share option scheme? And now when you have heard our issues.
I wish I had an easy answer, because you have to juggle your Estonian rules already and anticipating a potential US investor or US acquirer. When the acquirer can come from anywhere, it can come from Sweden or UK or Finland or whatnot, or from other Baltic places. I think what helps most, in my experience, and that doesn't only relate to stock options, is be as clear as you can under the local rules that you have done everything right. Don't leave there room for interpretation that you may have done it wrong even under local rules. So, for example, if you have an opportunity to get the Estonian or Latvian-Lithuanian tax authority ruling on something that you already have in place, and it takes 2 months, get it, even before you start some sort of a process, to make sure that everything that you already have is done right. because that avoids at least one discussion. Is like, well, we don't know even if these were done right, so we don't know what to even do with them. Maybe we have to fix something, and we don't want to fix something because then that creates draws attention to the tax authorities. So we don't want to go for a ruling on something else when we want to roll over. And frankly, that's not only a stock option question. As long as you comply very clearly with your local rules, the investor or acquirer will come in with their own local counsel, and they can confirm that, yeah, this company has done everything by the book, they've done it really well. It makes the further discussion just so much easier on how to deal with transferring or transforming the locally acceptable options to a foreign plan. I would not worry too much at this point about granting those options that are already compliant with some imaginary or hypothetical US acquisition or investor.
Okay, thank you, Tavi, for those comments. Yeah, we have now coming to the end of our panel discussion, so I would really want to thank our participants and Janis Taukas and Tavi Janus about the discussion. It was really interesting. And I was honored to give a closing words also to the event. So this has also come to an end now. I would really want to thank you for the participation. I hope it was interesting for you and you found some tips at least to look out for when you go to the US, and you know that it may sometimes not be as easy as you think, and be always prepared for surprises. So this is one takeaway for me at least. If there were any unanswered questions, then we will revert with our answers later on, and then don't be worried. These will be answered. Otherwise, I wish you a pleasant evening, and don't forget, today is International Dance Day, so feel free to go dance, and I wish you a pleasant dance with your US investors and tax and legal environment around that. Thank you and have a nice evening.